interesting 4. These are more interesting because they're a little bit complicated, a little bit subtle. Let's start with actually the one that is my favorite. This is competence. Think about other people in your environment. Think about people who are competent. Generally, and think about people who are incompetent. Generally, we are more attracted to people who seem competent to us. Now that isn't very interesting. And it turns out that's not really the effect. Yes, we're more attracted to people who are competent than people we think are incompetent. But people who are super competent, people who seem competent on all dimensions, they're kind of threatening to us. They don't make us feel so good about ourselves, right? They make us feel a bit diminished by comparison. So what we really like, the kind of person we're really attracted to, is the competent individual who occasionally blunders. And this is called the pratfall effect, that our liking for the competent person grows when they make a mistake, when they do something embarrassing, when they have a failure experience. Okay? You can see this with public figures. Public figures who are viewed as competent, but who pratfall, who make a mistake, sometimes they're even more popular after the mistake. Okay? I think of Bill Clinton when he was president. His popularity at the end of his term, despite what everyone would agree, whether you like Bill Clinton or not, was a big mistake with Monica Lewinsky. His popularity didn't suffer very much. A lot of people in the media would describe him, well, it just shows he's human. He makes mistakes like the rest of us, even though that was a pretty big mistake. Right? And you can see this even with smaller pratfalls. Sometimes public figures are liked even more after their pratfall. Now, the classic experiment, the classic pratfall experiment is just a beautiful one to describe. It's a work of art, so let me tell you a little bit about it. You're in this experiment, you're brought to the lab, and you're listening to a tape recording of interviews with people who are described as possible representatives from your college to appear on a quiz show. The quiz show is called College Bowl, which I don't think is on anymore, but was on when I was in college. And you're listening to interviews with possible contestants from Yale who are going to be on College Bowl. You have to decide how much, what you're told is you have to decide who should be chosen to be on College Bowl. And you listen to these interviews. Now, what's interesting is there's 2 types of people. The nearly perfect person and the mediocre person. The nearly perfect person answered 92% of the questions correctly, admitted modestly to being a member of the campus honor society, was the editor of the yearbook, and ran varsity track. That's the nearly perfect person. The mediocre person answers only 30% of the questions correctly, admits that he has only average grades. He worked on the yearbook as a proofreader, and he tried out for the track team but didn't make it. So you see they're keeping a lot of the elements consistent, but in one case he's kind of an average performer, and in the other case, nearly perfect. Now, which of these 2 people do you find more attractive in listening to the tape? So when they ask you questions about which person should be on the quiz show, people say the more competent person, but they also ask questions like, how attractive do you find this person? Now, you're only listening to an audio tape. How attractive do you find this person? And the results are pretty obvious. The competent person is rated as much more attractive, considerably more attractive, than the mediocre person. Okay? If this were the end of the story, though, it would be a kind of boring story, and it's not the end of the story. Now what happens is half of the participants in the experiment who have listened to each of these tapes, you only get to listen to one tape, half of them are assigned to the blunder condition. And what happens in the blunder condition is the tape continues, and what you hear is the clattering of dishes, the person saying, oh my goodness, I've spilled coffee all over my new suit. Okay? That's the blunder. That's the pratfall. Now you're asked, who do you find more attractive? And look what happens. Your rating of the attractiveness of the competent person grows even higher. The competent person who blunders, this is the person that I love. Unfortunately, the mediocre person who blunders, you now think is even more mediocre. Right? This is the sad irony in these experiments. The effect works both ways. So the mediocre become even more lowered in your esteem, in your regard. Now I'll tell you a little personal story about my coming to Yale that relates to this experiment. This is one of the most famous experiments in the history of social psychology. I wouldn't quite put it up there. You'll hear maybe later about, or maybe you've already, about Milgram and maybe Asch conformity and maybe Robert's cave. Those are even better known than this, but this is right up there. This is a top 5 experiment. And it was done by Elliot Aronson, who has retired now, but for many years taught at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Name is not one that you need to know. In any case, I came to Yale in 1981 as a graduate student, and I was looking for an advisor, and I was kind of interviewing with a faculty member at Yale at the time named Judy Rodin. Some of you may know that name because she went on later to become the president of the University of Pennsylvania and now is the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. But I was interviewing with her, I set up a meeting, and what I was trying to persuade her in this meeting was to take me on as one of her students, to be my advisor. And it's about my 3rd or 4th week of graduate school, and I'm pretty nervous about this, and she could be intimidating to a first-year graduate student. And I remember I was holding this mug of coffee, and I was pleading with her, trying to convince her to take me on as her student. I was saying, Judy, I'll get a lot done, I'll work really hard, I can analyze data, I can write, and I'm talking about myself, and I'm swinging, I'm using my hands as I talk, I'm swinging this cup of coffee around, and fairly soon into the conversation, I demonstrated some principle that you've probably learned in your physics class, having to do with an object at rest remaining at rest unless acted upon by a force. Well, the object at rest was the coffee in the cup. And when I pulled the coffee cup out from under the coffee, it landed right on her desk and I watched in slow motion as this wave of coffee just moved from my side of the desk to her side of the desk. She jumped up and jumped back and started moving papers around and really was giving me this look like, why don't you just leave? So I was trying to save the moment as best as I could, and I looked at her and I said, Judy, you remember that old experiment that Elliot Aronson did on attractiveness? She looked at me kind of out of the corner of her eye. I said, well, that was my blunder. Now you're going to like me even more. And she just shook her head and she said, Peter, you know that effect only works if I think you're competent first. Anyway, that was my introduction to Yale, graduate school at Yale. All right, so blundering, only blunder if you're competent first, and it will make you more attractive. That is the pratfall effect. Let's move on. And I'm going to move a little bit quickly through all of this because I want to leave time for a few questions at the end of the lecture. Let's talk about physical attractiveness as number 2 of the more interesting 4. Now, physical attractiveness is one that really bothers us. We don't like to believe that physical attractiveness accounts for much in life. It seems unfair. Except at the margins, there isn't much we can do about physical attractiveness. And when we're not pictured in the rumpus, it can really hurt, So we don't like to believe that physical attractiveness matters. And the interesting thing is if you do surveys of college students and you say to them, rate how important different characteristics are in relationships that you might be involved in, they will say that warmth is important, sensitivity is important, intelligence is important, compassion is important, sense of humor is important, and they'll say that looks aren't important. But if you measure all of those things, let's do it in a different order. If you send everybody out on a blind date, and then you look at, after the blind date, how many of those people who are matched up blindly actually go on a second date, actually get together again? What predicts who gets together again? Was it the rating of warmth? No. Sensitivity? No. Intelligence? No. Compassion? No. Sense of humor? No. What was it? Looks. So we believe that looks don't matter. And unfortunately, they do. Now, the good news in all of this is the studies that looked at physical attractiveness in this way were just looking at what predicts a second date after a first date. Obviously, what predicts a long-term relationship are probably things less superficial than looks, or at least other things in addition to looks. But it is a great predictor of a second date. And college students, year after year, say, but it's not important. And it's one of those classic dissociations between what we think is important and what empirically turns out to be more important. All right, well, there are very interesting studies that have been done with physical attractiveness. At the University of Minnesota, a computer algorithm paired people up. Couldn't have been a very complicated algorithm because it basically paired people up randomly on the campus. But a lot of data about all the students on campus were collected, and people were then randomly paired up and sent to the dance, and then they were tracked over time. And just as in the thought experiment I just gave you, the University of Minnesota students acted in the same way. If they rated their partner as attractive, the randomly assigned partner, they were more likely to continue the relationship. Now, it's interesting to ask why, and we have to start to look at other experiments to try to get at what is it about physical attractiveness that makes people want to pursue the relationship. And once again, Elliot Aronson, the person who did the blunder experiment, the pratfall experiment, he did some nice work on attractiveness as well. And in one experiment, which many people know as the frizzy wig experiment, he did the following. He invited a confederate, a graduate student who was working with him in his lab. Social psychologists always called people who were in the employ of the experimenter confederates. Doesn't mean that they grew up south of the Mason-Dixon line or wave a certain kind of flag. But the older term for it was stooge. They would say, we hired a stooge to act in the following role in the experiment. But I think a certain generation of college students thought stooges were only named Moe, Larry, and Curly. And so they started to use this phrase confederate. Now they'll usually just say we hired an actor. But anyway, the confederate that they hired was a woman who is naturally attractive in most people's view. But they made her look either more attractive or less attractive by giving her kind of frumpy clothes, bad makeup, and a frizzy wig. And it was the frizzy wig that everybody remembers from this experiment. And what she does in the experiment is she poses as a graduate student in clinical psychology who is interviewing male participants, only men in this experiment. And at the end of the interview, she gives them her own personal clinical evaluation of their personality. Okay? So that's all it is. They have this interview with this woman. She's either made to look very good or she's made to look kind of ugly with this frizzy wig. And they talk to her. She gives them an evaluation of their personality. Half of the subjects receive a favorable personality assessment. Half of them receive a kind of unfavorable evaluation. How do they respond? Well, when she was made to look attractive, they were delighted when she gave them positive feedback about themselves. When she was made to look, when she was made to look attractive, but gave them unfavorable information about themselves, they were really upset about it. When she was made to look unattractive, they didn't really care what kind of information she gave. It didn't really matter whether it was positive or not. It didn't really make any difference. It was interesting, in the condition where she was made to look attractive but gave you bad feedback about yourself, often the subjects in that condition would look for an opportunity to interact with her in the future, obviously to try to prove that her evaluation was wrong. It mattered that much to them. So there's kind of this idea that attractive people, their feedback to us has more impact. I'm not saying this is fair. I'm not saying it's rational. I'm not endorsing it. But empirically, excuse me, empirically, we can see it. That somehow the feedback from the attractive person matters more to us. Okay, number 3 of the more interesting 4, gain loss. This is really a general idea in psychology that we are in a way wired up to be more sensitive to change than to steady states. And you can imagine why that might be true. Change often signals danger or opportunity. And if we're especially tuned in to change, it helps us survive, and it helps us pass along our genes. Okay? So we're more sensitive to change. How does that play out in love? Well, in love, what is very powerful to us is not just that someone always is positive toward us. I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love, right? It wears out its welcome. What's more powerful is the person who was not that positive to us, but over time becomes more positive. The first derivative of their regard for us is positive. Okay? Aronson calls this the gain effect. We are really attracted to people whose regard for us is gaining momentum over time. Okay? And even if over a period of time the average amount of their regard is lower, because they started lower and then got higher, than someone who was always high, it's the ones who were first lower who then went up that capture our attention. The first derivative is more important than just the position of their regard for us, getting better and better. Now, what's interesting is there's also a loss effect. People who really hurt us are not the people who have always been negative. The person who every time they sees you, hates you, says they hate you, and accompanies it with an obscene gesture, after a while, this person can't hurt you, right? There's a country song that Ricky Skaggs sings that has the phrase in it, "Nothing can hurt you like the person you love." That's what hurts. The person who always was positive, whose regard starts to fade. You can only hurt the one you love, right? You can only hurt the one you love because you are expecting positive feedback from the one you love. And when that turns negative, it's a blow. It's a blow to the solar plexus, right? So you can only hurt the one you can love, but the one who always loves you sometimes has trouble showing you that they love you. The one who didn't really love you that much, but then starts to show you that they love you, that person is a powerful influence on your behavior. Okay, the last set of studies. Have you talked about Schachter Singer's emotion? Okay, so let me describe to you this phenomenon. This is a phenomenon about the misattribution for the causes of arousal. You feel physiologically aroused, but you're not completely sure why. and you have to make up an explanation for it. I think what I want to do, and sometimes that explanation is accurate, but the ones that are interesting here are the ones where you misattribute the cause of the arousal. You make a mistake and think it's love when it might be due to something else. So let's do a thought experiment. I'm a Yale College student for the purposes of this thought experiment. And I live in Pearson because I need to walk a great distance to Chapel Street, to the Starbucks on Chapel Street. And I have a friend who I don't know that well, somebody who was sitting next to me in class a few weeks in a row, and I said, you know, would you like to go see the New Blue in concert and then get coffee after it Friday night? And she says to me, sure, I would do that. And so the New Blue concert takes place in the Pearson Davenport Theater in the basement there, what used to be a squash court. It is now a little theater. And we enjoy ourselves at the concert. And then I say, let's go to Starbucks and get a coffee. And so we walk that distance from Pearson College down to the York Street gate, over to Chapel Street, make the left on Chapel Street, another block down to High, walk into the Starbucks. And she says to me, you know, I better have a decaf because it's kind of late. I want to be able to sleep. And I say, that's fine, whatever you want. She says, yes, I'll have a decaf double espresso mocha skinny with a, what? What other dimensions are there? Right? A double espresso mocha skinny, frothed. And I say, okay, fine, I'll have a coffee. And I go up there and I order the drinks. I'll have a small coffee, please, and a double espresso mocha skinny frothed. Except the barista makes a mistake. Did the word barista exist before Starbucks? I don't think so. The barista makes a mistake. The barista uses caffeinated coffee in the drink instead of decaf. Doesn't tell anybody, doesn't tell me, I don't see it. I just come back with my black coffee and my double espresso mocha latte skinny frothed. Except it isn't espresso. It's got 2 shots of caffeinated espresso. I'm sorry, it isn't decaffeinated. It's got 2 shots of caffeinated espresso in it. And I put it down on the table, and we're having this nice conversation, and we're drinking our beverages, and it's about 12:30, 1 o'clock now, and Starbucks is closing, and it's time to walk back to Pearson. And we're walking back to Pearson, and we leave the Starbucks. We make a left on Chapel Street. We're walking up to York. I'm getting a little sleepy. But my friend looks at me and says, I feel a little funny. What's actually happening? Her heart is beating a little faster. Her palms are beginning to sweat. Her breath is coming a little shorter than it otherwise would. I don't know. Is it warm in here? She says, I don't think I've felt this way in a very long time. Gee, it couldn't be the coffee. I ordered decaf. What could this be? What? Then she turns and she looks at me. And she says, what a day this has been. What a rare mood I'm in. Why, it's almost like being in love. And it is almost like being in love, except what it really is 2 shots of caffeinated espresso causing a rapid heart rate, an increase in respiration, sweaty palms, but I don't realize, she doesn't realize that's what it is. She turns to the most salient, this is the way social psychologists would say it, turns to the most salient object in her immediate social environment, that would be me, and says she's in love. That's the idea of misattribution. Aroused due to something else, don't know what that is. It's best if you don't know what that is. Or even if you do, mistakenly attribute it, misattribute it to physical attraction, romance, intimacy, passion, and commitment. It's love. All right, now, I don't necessarily recommend that you do this thought experiment in vivo this weekend, although if you're lonely, you might want to try it. But we can take this idea right, we can actually do research on this. We can take it into the lab. But before I tell you about lab experiments, let me tell you about the most famous field experiment on this idea. We call this the Rickety Bridge experiment, and there's a bridge at the University of British Columbia that crosses a river that runs through campus. And there's actually two bridges. The Rickety Bridge is one that's kind of a rope bridge. It's hundreds of feet above the river. It sways in the breeze. It's only about 3 feet wide. You kind of hold on to it carefully and you cross the river. It's a pretty scary way to cross that river. Has anybody seen this bridge? It's still there. Yes, you know this bridge. Okay. There's another way to cross the river. It's on a low bridge near the water, solid wood planks, nice and wide, hand railings made out of solid wood, and you can cross the bridge that way. So what two investigators at the University of British Columbia did is they simply positioned, once again, an attractive actor or confederate on one side of the bridge. She was a woman, and she met men crossing the bridge. And she would intercept them as they came across the rickety bridge or the low bridge. And she would ask them a few questions and conclude with, can you write me a story? It would help me out with my experiment if you just write a little story right now. Then she would collect their story and she would say, if you have any questions about this experiment, here's my phone number. Actually, this happens when you're in experiments. You get the phone number of the experiment. What happens? Well, the male students who crossed the rickety bridge, they wrote these sexy stories with interesting content, with kind of little bit ribald themes. And the people on the solid bridge, they just wrote pretty boring stories. The people who crossed the rickety bridge were more likely to call her up later and say, yeah, I'd like to talk about that experiment I was in. Can we meet at the Starbucks? You drink decaf, don't you? Right? And the people on the low bridge were much less likely to call her up. Okay? What was going on? Well, this was interpreted as misattributed arousal. On the rickety bridge, you're swaying in the breeze, hundreds of feet above the water. The bridge seems unstable. Maybe you'll make it, maybe you won't. Your heart is beating. Your palms are sweating. You're breathing harder. You meet this person and she seems more attractive because you're feeling all these things and you attribute it to the attraction. Now, there's a reason why this study is bad science. There's a major flaw in this study. The clue to the flaw is that you can't even call this study an experiment. What's the flaw? Anybody? Yes?
People who would take the rickety bridge might be more likely to be more for adventure.
People who take the rickety bridge might be the kind of people who are more looking for adventure than the people who take the solid bridge. Right. Another way of saying it is there isn't random assignment of the subjects to the two conditions in the study. That's no random assignment, it's not an experiment. By not randomly assigning people to these two conditions, you may be capturing just individual differences in the kind of person who, when there's a perfectly stable, safe, low bridge, says, I don't want to go on that bridge. I want to go on the bridge where I have to risk my life to get to class. And then should it surprise us that that's the kind of person who would call a perfect stranger on the telephone and write a sexy story and give it to them? Right? We're not so surprised. So what we have to do, of course, is take it into the lab and do this in a more systematic way with random assignment. And this is how I want to finish up today. We have till 2:45, 3:45? Okay, great. I'll take about 5 more minutes to finish up, and that'll give us some time for questions. So how do you do this in the lab? Well, you can bring people into the lab, and I can present you with a confederate who said, let's say you are all in condition 1, everybody on this side of the room, and I can say to all of you, please wait here. We'll begin the experiment in a moment. While you're waiting, please fill out this form. And the form includes how attracted you are to the experimenter, to me. I can do the same thing over here. I can give you the form that asks you to rate how attractive you think I am, and I can give you the same instruction with a crucial difference. Please wait here. We will begin the painful shock experiment in a moment. Please fill out these forms while you wait. What happens? The people who got the painful shock instruction are more likely to find the confederate attractive. Why? Well, they're sitting there thinking about painful shock. It's making their heart beat faster. It's making their palms sweat. It's making them breathe harder, maybe. And even though it's fairly obvious what's doing that, they still misattribute that arousal to, I must be falling in love. Even with that obvious an instruction. You can do this in other ways. You can bring, here's one of my favorite ones. You bring people in the lab. We'll make them the control group this time. We bring you to the lab and we say to this group of people, please wait here. We'll begin the experiment in a moment. You can fill out these forms in the meantime. The forms ask how attracted you are to the experimenter. You're now in the experimental group, and I say, please wait here. We'll begin the experiment in a moment. I'm going to ask you to fill out some forms. But first, to get ready for this experiment, I'd like you to get on this treadmill and run for 10 minutes. So you've run on the treadmill. You've just sat around. The people who've run on the treadmill, even when that arousal is fairly obvious, you're doing a little bit of aerobic exercise, you still find the experimenter more attractive. Okay? This is why the 4th floor of Payne Whitney Gym is such a dangerous place. And I urge you as your dean to be very careful there. Okay? It's that combination of aerobic exercise and spandex that leads to trouble. All right, now, here's the final experiment, and I apologize for this. It is a bit sexist in 2007 context. But let me explain, and we could never do this, and one could never do this experiment today, but let me go through it with you, and you'll apologize for its some of its qualities. In this experiment, male subjects were brought into the lab, and they were asked to look at centerfolds from Playboy magazine. So these are essentially photographs of naked women. And they are wearing headphones that amplify their heartbeat. And they are asked, among other things, how attracted are they to the centerfold photograph that they're looking at. So maybe, I don't remember how many they look at, maybe it's about 10. So these slides are coming up. They've got the headphones on. The headphones are amplifying their heartbeat. And the slides are moving one after another for a few seconds each slide. And they're listening to their heartbeat. Slide 1. Slide 2. Slide 3. Slide 4. Slide 5. Slide 6. And then they're asked, which one did you find most attractive? Which one were you most attracted to? Oh, slide 5. Absolutely. She's the woman I want to marry. Okay? And what has happened is they're using this bodily cue of their heartbeat to infer that that's who they find more attractive. Now here's the twist. They're not actually listening to their heartbeat. They're listening to a tape recording of a heartbeat, and the experimenter is back there with the speed knob, and at random intervals, he just speeds up the tape of their heart and then slows it down again. And it doesn't matter which slide he speeds up the tape of the heartbeat on. That's the one the subject is more likely to think is the person of their dreams, the person they're attracted to.